from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we are most pleased to continue our series that we are bringing to you entitled An Affair with the Arts and Humanities. For you who have watched in the past weeks, you know that this is a symposium that was held at North Idaho College in March of 1995 to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum. And for 7 days we examined this wonderful area called the Arts and Humanities. On today's program we are most fortunate to have one of those presenters at that symposium on the day that we talked about An Affair with Words. Our guest is Karin Swenson, who is really known not only nationally but internationally as a poet and author. She comes to us on this visit from New York City. Our distinguished guest won in 1993 the National Poetry Series Prize for her work titled The Lady in Bangkok. Landlady, excuse me, yes. And let me indicate that in winning that, she had, as she has continued to do, it's been part of her time in Southeast Asia where this work took place. She also has been honored by the Pushcart Prize, the Aravan Foundation also in England, and also the Anne Stanford Award. Her individual poems have appeared in many leading magazines such as The New Yorker, The Saturday Review, and the Denver Quarterly. Ms. Swenson, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
And I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists to question our guest today. First of all is Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
Well, Karin, it's a real pleasure to have you here. I know that you have come from a very large city, and I think perhaps such a distinguished career as you've had must have had a beginning somewhere. So how did you begin to become interested in words? Did you always love the language?
I think I always did, and I think I always did because my mother read aloud to me. She read poetry to me. I still have the first poetry book I ever owned, which was an extremely inexpensive edition of children's poetry, but included Robert Frost and people of that caliber, as well as people who have long since disappeared into the dark. I think I was encouraged to be interested in words, and I was certainly encouraged to read. And my mother insisted from a very early age that I write letters. And I had a gaggle of great aunts out in Fargo, North Dakota. And they had to be written thank you notes and so on. And then you had to add something. You couldn't just say thank you. You had to say other things. And the writing really came out of the beginning of duty, I think. And then I had teachers who encouraged me as well.
So then as you progressed through college, you began to write more and more. Did you feel different? Did you feel that you were more called to the arts, to the humanities, than perhaps some of your friends were?
I don't think I thought about that at all. I don't know, and I don't know that I wrote more. I went through a long period where I didn't write at all, and it made me feel bad about myself. I mean, it just didn't feel good. It just didn't feel good. It wasn't that it didn't come out, it was that I ignored it for a while. And then after my son was born, I started, when you have a child, as you probably know, you have to be around, but frequently you aren't doing much. And it's a good time to write. And so I started writing then, and started sending things out then.
And as you wrote more, did you feel like you were getting better? Or did you think that some of the most creative things you've done were relatively early on?
No. I can't say that I thought some of the most creative things I'd done were early on. I found it very frustrating to tell what was good and what wasn't as good, because I was not only doing the writing, but I was also judging my own writing. So I was jury and chief executioner, and that's a very difficult task. And for many, many years, I had a hard time figuring that out. And what I finally did was to join. There were open readings in New York at that time, as there still are. And I would go to those and I would read my work. I would listen to other people's work. And the interesting thing is, I don't know whether this is true for other arts, but it is certainly true for language arts, that you can hear what's bad. And so I would listen to someone and think, I don't want to do that. Strike that phrase. That kind of phrase is out, or that way of presenting something, that's out. I won't do that. And that helped considerably, because of course when you've got a really beautiful piece of work in front of you, a poem by Yeats, you can't figure out, it's seamless. You can't imagine how this man ever got there. And it's very frustrating. Whereas you can hear the clinkers in other people's work when it's not so good.
Steve Sheen.
We had a wonderful conversation before the show started, so I learned a little bit more about you. So I know that you have been a college teacher in addition to your poetry writing, and that you also write for some very prestigious newspapers in the country, travel articles and political articles. When you were talking with Janelle about how you developed your interest in poetry, though, it sounded as though you were largely self-taught. Is that true?
Yes, almost exclusively self-taught. I was really frightened and shy and afraid of exposing myself. So that leaves you no alternative except to be self-taught. And I took one course in college in short story writing, and I didn't do particularly well, I don't think. But the teacher did me an enormous favor. He had me, and all of us, write 500 words a day for 5 days a week. And that is an enormous amount of production. If you count up what that means in a semester, you've written a novel at the end of the semester, a short novel by the end of the semester.
And this was prose that
and
you
this
were
was
writing.
prose, but it didn't make any difference. What it did was just to loosen you up so that you could write. You stopped. So much of what happens is that people get into self-criticism so much that they tighten up. And this just killed that, because you weren't going to get those 500 words written if you sat around criticizing yourself and saying, well, maybe it ought to be this way, maybe it ought to be that way. No, you just went ahead and did it.
Has that remained your writing style to this day? Do you try to get words down on paper and then worry about polishing them after
That's
the fact?
right, yeah. Just get it down best you can, and then go back. And the big help in that was, at some point in my life, someone, and I cannot remember who I owe the thanks to, said, have you ever looked at Yeats's revisions? And I said, no. And he said, well, there's a book in the library that'll show you photographic copies of Yeats's revisions. And I went and I looked, and it turned out that what he did was to write a line, and then he would write the line over and over 20, 30 times, changing it. And then he'd start on another line, and he would do this same process. And that what you need is someone to help you demystify the process, and that helped enormously. That and writing 500 words a day.
Looking back, can you point to other major influences that have helped shape your poetry?
Yeah, and some of them unfortunate. Not so much poetry as writing in general. When I was in high school, I wrote short stories, and I won a national scholastic contest. And I think it hurt me much more than it helped me, because it made me think I had to be so terribly good that the self-criticism factor came in and just kept me from writing. I just couldn't do it. I was looking for some plot no one had ever thought of before, something utterly unique. And it really caused me a great deal of trouble. It's taken me many, many years to understand that you have to think of yourself as a garden variety writer in order to be able to write, and not think of yourself as something special or unique.
Ms. Vinson, when I introduced you on the program, I indicated among the many honors that you've received, certainly one of the most cherished by poets would be the National Poetry Series Prize that you received in 1993. And I'm always thinking of our viewers, and I know they would be most appreciative if you would share one of your works with them at this time.
I think what I'll read is the title poem of the book, which is The Landlady in Bangkok. Now, when I first went traveling in Southeast Asia, I had been very dutiful. I had read my my guidebooks and so on, and I had an idea of how I wanted to travel, which was that I wanted to stay in what are called guest houses rather than in hotels. First of all, because they're considerably cheaper, but also because it seemed to me that you would be closer to the people of the country if you did that, because part of the difficulty is if you go to nice hotels, you're putting your money between you and the people of the country, and they think, oh, another rich American. Mm-hmm. And I got to Bangkok, as you do get to Bangkok. It was 2 a.m., and my courage was at low ebb. And after I had faced those taxi drivers who were like sharks, I felt like a little goldfish. I didn't go to the guest house. I went to a hotel. And I spent my time in Bangkok sort of schizophrenically, because during the day I would be in Bangkok, and then I would go back to this hotel, and I would be in Cincinnati for the night. And then I'd have to go back into Bangkok. I went up north, and as I came down, I got sufficiently acclimated so that I could go to a guest house. And I came back to Bangkok and very proudly walked up this alley where there was the Lek and the Suniporn guest house. And at the Suniporn was Suni, a woman of about my age, who was running this guest house. And we were intensely curious about each other, and we didn't have a common language to use. And I found out that all her other guests were also very curious about her, because it's rather unusual for a woman to be running a guest house in Thailand. And I discovered that the way we took care of this problem was that we invented each other. And I guess the other thing I have to explain is that in Thailand, if you go to the shrines or the temples, you will frequently find vendors outside selling cages of sparrows. And you buy a cage of sparrows, and you walk up the steps of the shrine, and you open the cage, and the sparrows burst out into flight. You do this because in Buddhism you gain merit when you free anything that has been imprisoned. You also do it because it's what you are hoping will happen to your soul when you die, that it will not be imprisoned in rebirth after rebirth in samsara, but will burst out into the air of nirvana. The Landlady in Bangkok. Because separated from us by a language, we find her a character without a plot, a cotyledon without an ecosystem. We invent her a husband in the alley court, a barren womb in this quiet cell of Bangkok's hive under trellised vines in tin cans. We graft invention on observation, imagine her dispossessed by a second wife's fecundity, while she keeps her clothes in plastic bags and sleeps upstairs on the corridor floor before doors of the Spartan rooms she rents us. We pass on hypotheses with other travelers' news, names of hotels in Burma, prices of guides in Borneo. We know she counts herself to sleep with our money, yet hoards notebooks grinning with our faces, which she forgets, with our comments she can't read. But her records, like our fabrications, are errant gestures around a kind of love. She has no picture for our words for home, as we've no history for the wheel of scar raised on her shoulder, as at the temple stairs she buys piping sparrows in wooden cages and frees them to gain merit, each a traveler, fluttering from samsara to nirvana.
So beautiful and so well read.
Thank you.
Janelle Burke.
Very, very eloquent use of the language. And so I want to ask you a question about that. How do you learn to express yourself with just the right words?
Oh, well, I don't think you ever feel you've done that. That's always what
But it
you're
looks so
groping
easy.
toward.
It looks so easy when you do it.
Well, thank you. I think what you do is you read. And you read, and you read, and you read. And you start picking out, who it is that does it so that it makes you shiver, or so that you go back to it. And poetry, of course, is unlike prose, something that is written to carry with you. It isn't to be read once and enjoyed. It is something that I think we turn to when there's been a death, when there's some tragedy. You tend to go back to poems that have meant something to you in your own history. I know that when my mother died, I went back to Chaucer.
So it's really, the language keeps evolving too with you, is that correct?
It evolves, and you find it may indeed be that when you're 20 you don't like Shakespeare, but it may indeed be that when you're 45 there isn't anybody you would rather spend time with.
How often do you think we look at words on the printed page and we go back later and we see a new meaning? And does that happen on a regular basis? And can people feel comfortable about that?
That should happen. That should happen with poetry. I mean, that poetry should not be something that you read once and when you go back you find it says exactly the same thing to you. There should be another angle that you didn't see the first time. There should be another meaning that didn't occur to you at that time. There should be some further insight.
And that's what gives it its richness.
And that's what gives it, sure, that's what gives it the richness. Yeah.
Steve Sheen.
Who is it that you have found, poets, both, and you mentioned two classics, obviously Chaucer and Shakespeare, but or classic writers. Who are those writers that you look to for inspiration?
Well, they're certainly the classic writers. I mean, I love Chaucer's humanity, and he worries so about marriage and family and what it is that makes a marriage. This is something that is very important to Chaucer, and he understands it's difficult. And Shakespeare's language is just incredibly rich. Mm-hmm. And then in our own time, there was Elizabeth Bishop, who I think is just gorgeous and thrilling. And writing right now, there's a Native American woman, Linda Hogan, whose book, The Book of Medicines, I think is just brilliant. It's harder to find people in your own time because there is such a surplus. There are so many people writing, and to find your people, you have to weed through that and find the people who touch your imagination. But certainly Yeats, and certainly Eliot, and certainly Wallace Stevens were important people to me.
What, and I'm going to change directions here quite a bit, but and again, this is something we talked about before the show started, but the title of the book of poetry you just read from, again, illustrates that long interest of yours in Southeast Asia. How much of your poetry relates back to that area as a source of its...
Only this book. The book before this was about the United States, because I had spent 6 years of my life as a vagabond teacher and had taught at the University of Idaho, the University of Denver, Scripps College in Southern California, various places. I'd also worked as a poet in the schools all around this, particularly in the West. And the poems came out of that experience in that case. I seem to be very taken with the problem of myself and place, or other people and place. And the fact that though it's a strange place, it isn't strange because human beings are just human beings.
That pattern of finding something or someone out of your own experience as sort of the genesis for a poem, is that pretty common?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I really I like people, and I'm interested in people, and so very often what happens is that someone's story brings a poem out of me.
And if Tony will permit me one more question, poetry, of course, is obviously one of the areas where you have succeeded so well. But again, as I said earlier in another line of questioning, you're also an accomplished writer of political commentary and travel articles. Do you get the same sort of satisfaction from writing?
Yeah, it's different. It's a little different satisfaction. I love writing travel articles because I really want people to enjoy what I have enjoyed. And the articles, particularly for the Wall Street Journal, are done in that fashion. I want people to get a sense of what this is like.
So those travels, those aren't just research for your
no,
writing.
Those are not
That's
just
a labor
research.
of love, too.
Yeah, sure it is.
Good.
Definitely.
Good. Since you are very diverse in your writing as to subject matter and form, is there one particular form that you find easier, or do you find it all about the same as you make a decision to move into that area?
It's really, there is really a difference between writing prose and poetry.
Yes.
In the way you approach it. And it seems to me that you use words in a dramatically different manner. That when I write a prose article, I am using words perhaps the way a carpenter would use wood. But that when I write poetry, I'm using words the way a sculptor would use a piece of wood. He would be interested in the grain and how the grain ran, and would you want to use it in this direction, or would you want to use it in that direction, and what parts of the wood are darker and which parts of the wood are lighter, and how are you going to use what is intrinsic to the material. And that seems to me what the poet does, is the poet takes words and uses what is intrinsic to words. And you find yourself setting words as though they're jewels, so that all the different facets of meaning will catch the light.
We've been doing this program a long time, but I've never heard it so clearly explained, the difference between poetry and prose. That was just beautiful. One other question that I've asked many artists on this program, and people in the humanities also, and that has to do with, you're so productive, you publish so much, and again, for blooming individuals out there who are in the humanities, do you find it easier to write certain times of the week or the day, or does what kind? Do you have a rigid schedule?
You need a schedule. I mean, dependency on inspiration is only done by very foolish people. I write in the mornings, and I write from 2 to 4 hours every morning, 5 days a week.
So just like many other occupations, discipline is very important.
It is just a discipline, and it works better when you do it as a discipline. For me.
I think that's helpful to others that are seeking to go that path. Janelle Bird.
Well, I want to follow up on what Tony was just saying. Indeed, you have been a teacher, and I'm sure you've been an inspiration to many students. What do you recommend to students? Is this a good thing to do? Is writing a good thing to do? Will it live on? Are they going to be able to make livings?
You hope it will, but nothing's sure in human life, is it? So you have to go ahead and do what it is that makes you happy. If writing is what makes you happy, then you should be doing it. And I think what I urge my students to do is to establish a discipline for themselves where they write a certain amount a day, whether it's during the day, whether it's during the evening, that they not write sporadically, because you don't do as well. It's a bit like building a coral reef. You have to lay down a certain amount every day.
And do you think it's going to be something that's going to go on into the future?
You
Will
hope
writing
so.
always be here with us?
We hope so. We hope so. But you also know that that there is only time decides who lives and who dies in literature. And people who are very famous at the time sometimes are not read at all afterwards. And that's all right. They have served their purpose. They have helped people during their own lifetime to understand life. And then other people come up and are of much greater importance, perhaps, who weren't as important at that time.
Steve Sheen.
How are you dividing your time today? And I probably should get to a little bit more specific question amid that more general one. The 2 to 4 hours you talked about, is that just your poetry, or does that include your travel writing and your political commentary?
No, and I am not. Some people are capable of wearing a high-heeled shoe and a flat simultaneously and walking. I can't seem to do that. So I am either writing prose or else I am writing poetry. And just before I came out here, I sat down and I spent some time writing 3 articles for the Wall Street Journal, which, at their leisure they will publish. And when I go back, I will start writing poetry, because I haven't been writing poetry for a while.
Is there work in progress there?
Well, there will be work in progress. It's time to get down to it. But once you're published, you have to spend a year out there selling the book. And this has been that year.
On that note, I have the signal that we're out of time. Karen Swenson, we thank you so much for the generous time that you've given us, not only on this program, but at North Idaho College, as a very distinguished author and poet, and we thank you for that time. And I, again, also would like to thank the panel for their questions. May I say, as we are moving to the end of this particular program, we will be back with another program of the Arts and Humanities, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the Idaho Council on the Arts, and the Idaho Humanities Council, and the Watson consultants who have contributed to this series, along with the Associated Students at North Idaho College and North Idaho College. And I also want to recognize Steve Shink and his staff as the Dean of College Relations Development. They have made it possible for so many people to come. Their publicity and all their many, many works and the publications they put out to Steve are greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Tom.
By us very, very much. And I want to thank our crew also under the direction of Lindy Turner. This has been a very, very busy week for them, as we've done a lot of shows this week that you're seeing over the next few weeks. I would like to invite all of you to be with us again next week, as I indicated, when we will continue another program on the arts and humanities. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.